Hi there, hello, my name's Lines, it's great to see you. Now today we're going to be going through and doing a really accessible, beginner-friendly approach to how to do shading, both on the figure or on anything else. The first thing we'll do is break the shadow down into 3 shadow types. We'll have surface shadows, we'll have cast shadows, and then we'll have ambient occlusion. We'll then go through how to combine those into a figure or a subject with complete lighting. Now once we've done that, we're also going to do a full completed illustration going all the way from sketch, line art, colors, to finished illustration to demonstrate within the context of a finished professional illustration. Now once that's done, there's going to be a homework sheet for you to have a go of, and once you've had a go of that, you can pop it on our Discord, share it there with everyone else who's doing the homework. I go through and do marking and feedback on all the homework, usually every week or so when I publish a video, so it's usually a day or so after this comes out. Now other than that, you can like and subscribe. If you like this and want to see it more often or more consistently, consider becoming a Patreon member. To those who already have, I really appreciate it. And to those who are a Patreon member, there's also access to the original PSD files from the instruction sections of the video, as well as the Speedpaint towards the end, so you can open them up and see how the PSD files work. Now, if you also like the picture here, you can have a look at this and our other works on Redbubble. And also, there's going to be small group classes that will be starting relatively soon. So if you're interested in that, you can submit an expression of interest on the Discord if you'd like to take part once the Patreon tier for class attendance is launched. Now, with that done, let's get started. So, let's get started. First thing to do is break down shading into the 3 shadow types. First shadow type, or shading type, is going to be cast shadows, or projected shadows. This is where an object interrupts the path of light and projects its shape onto the ground or onto whatever object it hits after that. This is the shadow you cast, either on the ground or on yourself. Next type of shading is surface shadow. This is on the subject itself, where it's depicted darker the more that surface is facing away from the light source. But as the surface faces towards the light source, it becomes lighter. These will typically be more sort of softer, more rounded shadows than your projected shadows. Now the next thing is ambient occlusion. Now ambient occlusion is unique. Unlike the other 2 types of shadow, it actually has its own light source, which is the ambient light in the room, and isn't necessarily connected to the primary light source. This one just gets darker the harder it is for that surface to be reached by the ambient light around. And then we'll talk about how to combine them. Now we'll also talk very briefly about how to highlight. We won't go into highlighting too much, just because that one, to get into it properly, we need to talk about different material types. So we'll just be touching on that a little bit in this, as a way of sort of polishing the image a bit. But since it requires you understand the material, whether it's a hard shine or a soft shine, we'll cover that later. So let's get started then on cast shadow. So with cast shadow, you essentially map it out as a projection from the object casting the shadow. So here you can see we've drawn a line along it and projected that shape onto the ground, with it getting blurrier the further away it is, and less blurry the closer it is. Now to put that in context, let's draw a figure, because you won't really be drawing spheres very often. Primarily you'll be drawing more complicated subjects. So let's start with one. So we've got our figure drawn here. First thing we'll do is decide on our lighting direction and project out the top. That's the head. Now with that, so long as we keep that direction consistent, we're going to get all the rest of the parts of the body placed out right. So if we project along those same lines, the shoulders, as well as the rib cage, and then the elbows, that helps us place where those pieces are and where they'll be projected on the ground. Remember, with a cast shadow, you don't have to get it exactly right. So long as you get it roughly correct, you'll be fine. So now, with that outline done, we can then fill in where we feel the shading will be. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. So long as you've got it roughly right, it'll look fine. And so we've got where the shadow's been projected from the figure, and the smaller projections from the top of the leg to the ground. And if we take away those guidelines there, you can see we've got a fairly natural approach to the shadow. And now, to complete the context, we'll put in the surface shading. And that's going to be the figure where it's not lit. Since we know the light is coming from the top right, sort of a bit behind, we know then where the shadows should be on the figure. We'll get into the surface shadows in a second. Now, that's showing you how to get the shadow to connect the figure to the ground by casting a shadow on the ground. But the other thing that's really important with cast shadows is casting shadows onto the self. This one's really good for connecting parts of the body and giving them depth. So here we've got a character who's standing and they move their arms out forward. So what we're going to do is we'll have them lit from roughly the same angle, and we can see we've cast the shadow from the arm along the chest there. And then we've also shaded the leg on the left because it's behind the leg on the right. So these shadows can help really give the subject some depth. And of course you can still use them with the shadow cast onto the ground or the chair or whatever they're around, or whatever's in that path. It can even be another character or another object. And so long as we keep those directions consistent, we can again map out where we think the shadow will be that's cast on the ground, and that'll help us place the features there. So with that, we've got the rough shape. We can just project out the landmarks of the body, like the top and bottom of the head, the top and bottom of the rib cage, where the knee sections are, and that makes mapping out the shadow quite easy. And again, it doesn't have to be exact. So long as it's roughly right, it'll communicate well, and the viewer will understand where you're going for with it. And we'll just color that one blue so it matches. And you see there, it does look like it's fairly realistically lit from a strong light. Now the next thing to talk about is shadows cast on the self. This is where it really shines. So we'll sketch a figure here. We'll give them a fairly a large bust and have them leaning forward with their legs forward. What this will enable us to do is it'll give us lots of things to sort of cast shadow onto the self with. So we'll use that the chest there as a bit of a veranda that'll cast shadow down onto the legs to help give all of it a bit of depth. And we'll avoid pretty much every other kind of shadow and just do cast shadow. Now one way to do this on a more complex subject is what I call tying the shadows down with string. So similar to what you saw in that sphere picture there, we draw shadows by mapping them out first. Now you do this in your head, but to demonstrate, we'll use string from anywhere where it goes over the edge of the surface. So for instance, we'll have fall off once we get past the edge of the breasts, and we'll draw those lines down and we'll stop them where they hit a surface. Now this one's going to require you to think about the volumes of your subject and think about them in three-dimensional space. And so long as you keep those lines in a consistent direction, your cast shadows will look fairly consistent. And you can do this on things like the desk they're on. Now obviously the shadow for that one won't be in frame, but it'll help you decide where you want to have those shadows if you've got a larger composition. And you can see there, once we turn the sketch off and we just leave those lines, you can already kind of see the depth it gives to the figure. Now with that done, we can then start using that as a guide to fill in where we do the shadows. Again, you don't have to draw out these strings every time or any time. It's just a way of thinking about how the shadows are cast. And so you can see we've got the bit where the hair casts a shadow, where the head casts a shadow on the neck, then where the neck piece casts a shadow down, where the head has cast a shadow on the shoulder, and then under the breasts here over the midsection where there's a shadow there. I'm just moving from top to bottom and mapping those out. And obviously we're not going to do the shadow like between the shoulder and the hand, because that's just where the shadow is going. That's not where the shadow actually is. The shadow only exists when it contacts a surface. And so here you can see we've shaded the part of the torso on the right hand side, but not the left hand side, because the light's coming in from a little bit to the left. But it also helps us map out the shadows for things like the hands, and also map out the shadows for things like the props that they're on. And with that, you can see how much depth we've got just from adding those dropped shadows with just a very simple bit of blocked in shadow. Now the next thing to talk about is the way they share a light source. So your surface shadows and your cast shadows, they're shading based on the same light source. So one of the things you'll notice is that you can't have a cast shadow make a surface shadow any darker, because that part of it's already been excluded from the light source. So once it's missed out on the light, it's not getting any. And so it won't get darker again. They're not two separate ones, they're the same one. And of course the other thing to remember is the way cast shadows will be different. So cast shadows will typically have a harder edge to them than your surface shadows, but that edge gets softer the further away you get from the thing casting the shadow. The next thing I want to talk about is surface planes. So your directional shadow, so when it's shaded based on which direction the surface is facing, a great way to start with that is to break your figure or subject down into really simple surface planes. So we'll make a figure here that's specifically for having surface planes built on it. So once it's finished there, we're going to essentially make it into a PlayStation 1 game character and make them out of very, very simple polygons. And so we'll break it down into just simple shapes for the head, simple shapes for the arms, and then the body as well. So we'll give a surface plane for the top part of the chest, and then a bit for the bottom bit of the ribs there, the top part of the thighs. These simple shapes will help us get a starting point for how we want to shade our figure. Again, just like the last one, you don't have to do this. This is just a way you can think about it or start on it. So you can start shading your figure with big areas of shading and light, and then refine it from there. So here, we've shaded out those lower surfaces of the face and head. We've shaded that bottom part of the shelf of the breasts. We're going to shade the sides of the chest there, and the pelvis, because remember, if it's not pointing towards the light source, we're just going to shade it. And this isn't going to be the final shading for our figure, but this is just a guide to help us think of which way the surfaces are facing. So if it's not facing towards the light source, we're going to shade it out and just make it fully shaded. So for instance, the knees are bending under, so the front surface of the knees will be shaded. Now with that, let's grab our sketch and put it next to this, and we'll use this as a guide for how to place the surface shadows on our figure. So looking at our guide we've got there, they'll start top to bottom, and we'll shade out the face. So we'll have some shading around the bottom of the hair and the bun, and this face will be mostly shaded, but we'll leave a bit of highlight there across the bridge of the nose. It's a different shape to the reference, but you can see it's got that same rough placement. Now on the final one, we're also going to include the cast shadow of the head onto the collarbones and neck area. And now we'll do that bit of shading on the underside of the breasts there. And even though it's a rounded shape in the final drawing, you can see how much we're taking from that reference and how much to shade it. And the same thing there with that edge in the bottom part of the ribs. We can give a little bit of light where the bottom part of the ribs comes out below the breasts, but then we'll also shade the entire midsection because it's a surface that's facing down. And then the same thing with the knees. We'll detail them by shading it down. And you can see how similar it is to that reference, and that it is basically the same areas shaded and lit, but we've just added a bit of subtlety to complete it. Now, how do you get surface planes on rounded surfaces? Essentially what you do is you'll think of them and you'll break them down into polygons, into simple shapes. So for instance, with a ball, which is as round a shape as you can get, we could break that down into squares or triangles or whatever. Just like they do for video games, they break things into polygons. So here, we could have just a simple bit of shading where just one surface is facing close enough to the light source for it not to be shaded. And we can do this with a couple of layers. If we do another layer of shading, we'll do that one more step of little triangles out, and then we'll shade again. And once we've shaded again, you can see that even though it's just two hexagons, it actually does give the impression of a rounded shape. So simplified surface planes won't make your figure necessarily more angular, but they are going to help you communicate that shape and depth. Now, with that, we can also talk about how to decide how much shading to give a given surface, like how much to take it towards the shaded color. So imagine we have a circle here, and we break the surface of it into simple flat panels, like tiles. The tiles that are facing directly towards the light source get 100% lit, and the ones that are facing away, as the angle changes away from the light source, they get less and less lit. So imagining it at its simplest, the surface that's facing directly towards the light source, 100% lit. The ones at about 45 degrees, only about 50% lit. And one that can't be seen at all by the light source gets 0%. So think of it as whether that surface can be seen by the light source, or whether it's facing the light source. Now let's do a few different figures, or the same figure rather, at a few different angles. So with surface planes, it's all about whether it's facing the light source. So the first one here on the left, we're going to have that one that's basically facing directly towards the light source, with the light source being in front and maybe slightly above. With that, since most of the surfaces of the figure are fairly sort of flat, they're going to not be very shaded. They're only really going to be shaded on any surfaces that face away. So things like the underside of the breasts or the side of the body, where the body goes around and starts to face away from the light source. You might even maybe get a little bit of shading for like the belly there, on the underside of it. And then things like the crotch, the sides of the legs, but you will get a bit of a cast shadow there from one knee to the other. Because since one knee is coming in front of the other knee, and the light's coming from the front, that's going to cast a shadow. But then as we move down the foot, we're not going to get much shadow there at all. We're going to maybe get a little bit of shadow where there's the creases and folds around the ankle, and then maybe the drop shadow there. I'll sort of simplify one of them to remind us what direction it is. Now the second one here, we'll move it around to the side just a little bit. But you can see even just that little change of the lighting direction has helped us have an excuse to to shade the side of the hair, to shade the side of the breasts, and also shade the upper arm on the left-hand side there. Because now it's sort of pointed directly towards the light source, the surfaces can't be seen by it. And now we can do a bit more contour shaping on the midsection because the light's a bit to the side, which means those contours are going to show up more. You'll also notice the shadows will change on the knees. So since the knee on the right, the calf on the right is facing down, it's going to be shaded more. So these are surfaces that are now not facing towards the light source enough to be lit, and that'll help sort of darken them. Now here we'll move this light source around even more. Now it's basically straight on from the side. And with that, that means that a lot of the figure is going to be in shadow. So we'll do the face mostly in shadow because it's not sort of front on with the light source anymore. And things like the breasts, they're going to be shaded on the right-hand side because the light's on the left-hand side. So the left-hand side of them is no longer facing the light source. We can even cast some shadow onto the upper arm on the right, and we can cast some shadow down and around the body, and then the hair on the right is all going to be completely in shadow. You'll also notice the contours are going to change in how we describe them. So all of it's going to be shaded. We might still want to put a little highlight there on the navel, not because it looks correct, but because it looks nice. And rule of cool, if you think it looks good or just want to do it anyway, do it. Correctness always comes second in art. And so now we've got a different shading set on the feet because they're going to be facing away from the light a bit. Now this one, the last one, we're going to do that one lit from behind, which is sort of going to be the reverse of lit from the front. So where lit from the front was all lit except for the sides where it was shaded, this one's going to be all shaded except for the sides where it's lit. And so you can see there, if we put a shadow down to mark just sort of roughly the direction of the lighting, we can see that it's the same figure, but has a really different mood. And that's the other thing with how you light a figure. Lighting from the front's really good for being descriptive, but you'll notice that lighting from behind can give a much more sort of friendly or intimate sort of mood to it. So remember what your lighting does to the mood of a piece and your intention with it. Now, let's talk a little bit about ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion is the other light in the room. So where surface planes and cast shadows are based on the direct light source, ambient occlusion is based on how hard it is for the ambient light to reach. Ambient light's everywhere. It's bouncing around everywhere from every angle. And the less exposed a surface is, the less of that ambient light it will catch. You can think of it like you're trying to clean the dust off something. And as you wipe it, it's hard to sort of get into all the nooks and crannies and crevices. The same thing is true with ambient occlusion. If it's a hard to reach spot, light can't get there. And so you'll get ambient occlusion in those hard to reach spots. So if you imagine you're sort of polishing something, any surfaces that'll be hard to polish because they're creased in or they're recessed in, that's where you're going to get ambient occlusion. Now you wouldn't actually do the ambient occlusion with a soft airbrush like this. This is just to demonstrate that sort of soft positioning. So we'll mark out where we think the darkest spots are going to be, and they're the darkest bits of ambient occlusion. Now, if we're doing it, actually shading it, we're going to just put in those darkest spots where the light's going to have a lot of trouble reaching, where that ambient light really can't get in. So that's things like under the neck, the crease of the eye, the underarms, anywhere that you would have trouble sort of cleaning with a cloth, if you're like cleaning a figurine. Those areas are where that ambient shadow is going to be, those hard to reach spots. And it uses a separate light source from your directed light, which means you'll do it on top as essentially a second layer of shading. And if you don't include like surface shadows or cast shadows, it can be a really good way of depicting your character in a soft lighting scenario. So here, we're just going to have those darkest bits of ambient occlusion, and you can see it looks like it's soft lit. Now we'll throw a bit of highlighting over. Again, I do plan to do a separate video on highlights. They are related directly to material types, like surface, like materials, whether it's skin, whether it's fabric, whatever, for what sort of highlights you get. So for now, we're just going to do them on the figure wherever the figure's surface is facing towards the viewer, but you can see you get a different shine on the bikini top there to what you do on the skin. And you can see the difference there in that soft shading versus that hard shading. It's the same points, but describing it with a harder brush will make the character look a bit better. Now let's do 3 characters here, just to illustrate how we combine those shadows together onto a coherent image. Remembering that all these steps we've gone through are not something you're expected to do on the page. A lot of these are more things that you can do to, in your own head to plan out the image. But they can also be really useful to go over an image you've already done to see why the shadows aren't working. So you can cast little shadow strings down to see where the cast shadow should be, and that can help you self-check, or as a mental exercise, it can help you plan the image. Now on the character in the middle here, we'll do a projected shadow. So again, draw a line from the feet to the top of the head on the shadow on the ground. And then we just keep parallel lines from the line of the top of the head to the top of the line. And that'll help us map out those features for the shape of the shadow. And then the strings we use to cast shadows, they're all going to go in the same direction. So we're going to be using the same lighting direction for them. And here with the girl with the tail, we're going to have just a few cast shadows. So things like where the hair casts a shadow on the face and the shoulders cast a shadow on the back. Now we'll do a quick mock-up of these shadows. This isn't going to be the shading for the drawings themselves. This is just going to be here to illustrate for us where those drop shadows are, where those cast shadows are going to be on the figures. And then we'll use that as a reference when we actually shade it. Again, you don't have to do this. This is just to think about, to sort of conceptualize the shading as you're getting sort of started. And so this first bit is just the drop shadows. Now there's plenty of surface shading we could do, but we're just thinking about the drop shadows for now. Now for the surface planes, again, we'll break them up into simple PlayStation 1 characters, just very simple polygons. And with that, we'll have an idea of where those surface planes will be for us to have then those big areas of shading. And we can have in the pale areas, little bits of shadow, in the darker areas, little bits of highlight. But having that clear distinction between an area of shading and an area that is lit can really help give your character or object volume. And now we'll do a bit of a quick demo of where we think there's going to be ambient occlusion. Where is it going to be hard to polish the dust off? Where are the hard to reach surfaces that the light's going to have trouble getting to? And so things like under the neck, folds of the arm, under the tail, in this character here, under the neck, the folds of the eye, and also fabric. Fabric folds are a great place to put some ambient occlusion or some ambient shadow, and also folds in things like the shoes. And the other thing it's great for is describing a really detailed figure. So a really muscular figure like this one, the way you'll be doing a lot of the communication of that form is going to be with your ambient occlusion, because it's all sort of surfaces that are still going to be roughly lit, but you'll want to make them distinct using tone and not necessarily line. Line art can imply a fold over where you might just want to imply a sort of crease, but not actually something folding over. Now remembering that your directed light and your cast shadows share the same light source, so they won't overlap. So we'll merge those two together so they don't sort of darken each other because they're the same shadow. You can't darken them. They're either not getting to see the primary light source because they're facing away from it, or they're not getting to see the primary light source because they're blocked by something. And now here, we're going to start shading it in, and we're going to use that one as a guide, but we're going to make some changes. So for instance, I fully shaded the arm on the left and the leg on the left to send them back. Whereas with this character, I'm going to omit the large area of shading on the chest there, because the whole surface had sort of too much of a regular rhythm of shading. So I want to have a big area on the chest with no shading, and then on the lower part of the body, I'll have more shading, and help sort of break it up and give it a more organic and interesting rhythm by having a rest area without, consistent areas of shading, unshading, shading, unshading. Now with a character like this, really detailed one here, that's going to be an issue. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to plan to do a big block of shading over an area of the image to really help sort of separate it out. So what I'll do is, while I'm shading the chest here, you can see I'm fully blocking in shading on the left-hand side of the torso to help give it a bit of depth. Because if it just has the same amount of detail all over it, that'll sort of flatten the image like a page of Where's Wally. Because if everything's detailed, nothing is. Now with that, next thing to do is those bits of ambient occlusion. But what I might do first is just put this one and give it a bit of a mid-tone and throw a bit of highlights on there. Again, highlights are going to be their own video, but I just want to put some on there to communicate those surfaces where they're coming towards the light source, and also illustrate the importance of the different surface types. So you can see on the girl in the middle, we didn't really use much highlights, whereas the dude on the right, we do a ton of highlights because that skin is very shiny, and so we need to understand the materials. Now, here I'm dropping over the ambient occlusion shadows. You can see it's really useful for putting shading into an already shaded area, because again, it uses an independent light source. So in shadow areas, you can still have darker sections if they're ambiently occluded. And that's the three of them. We've got the first, the second, and the third. Now, with that, let's move on to the Speedpaint section. So, first thing I want to do is get my composition right. So I want to have the face the focus, and I'm going to draw the viewer in by having a lot of curled lines that sort of spiral in to that section there off to the left-hand side. So things like the hat brim will swirl in, the braids will swirl in, the arms will swirl in. It's all to direct the viewer to one specific spot on the image. And of course, with that then being the focus, we want to make sure that the face is fairly appealing. So we'll go for something fairly cutesy and sort of wholesome, and we'll get that sort of the big eyes and go for a kind of retro anime feel. I've been in a bit of a sort of retro mood for it ever since I saw the trailer for the new Ranma show they're running, which is also probably the main reason why this is a redhead with long pigtails. And so I've just got the basic forms of the body out. I'm just detailing the head in to make sure that one works conceptually before I detail out the rest. And now, just tuning those shapes in, getting the neck right, adding those little sort of curls of hair over the ears, and then getting the pelvis and thighs right. A lot of these are going to be covered by the flaps and flow of the dress, but I want what little of them that is going to be visible to be well placed. And so with that then, I'm just going to do some quick zippy lines for the flow of the skirt. And then just adjust the positioning of everything. So things like pull the neck down. Since it's a low angle, you would expect, the neck and shoulders to be quite close. And now getting some more just refinement on the shape of the flow of the dress. Again, I'm not paying too much attention to the fabric itself. I just want to focus more on the flow and the lines. And then adding in a bit of detail for things like the hat and the hair, and trying to get a sort of a less flat look to the braids, and just give them much more sort of pronounced divots. You'll notice that I do a sort of repeating onion shape. You can do braids by going left over right, right over left, left over right. That's fine, but this one is a lot easier, and it looks fine. So that's how I do braids. Now I'm just doing a bit of detail on the hat there. I don't want to do too much detail. I don't want to have it sort of grab attention by having a lot of line work on it. So I'm just doing sort of simplified little sections of straw coming off it. And now I'm testing how it's going to look with some freckles on there. And I think that's got the right sort of mood and the right kind of look to it. I want a sort of a lively, outdoors, sunny, sun-kissed sort of a look to it. So the sundress and big straw hat thing. And that's looking all right. So what I'll do now is, just before I move on, I'm going to get a really big brush and just sort of work out a test version of where I plan to do my shading. I've got it sort of imagined out, but I want to get an idea of it, whether it's going to work if I put the pen to the paper, and that looks pretty good. So I like that. I'll move that one and make a copy of that off to another desktop so I've got a reference for it. And now here, I'm just going to do a bit of a detail, some line art for the intended background clouds, because it's a low angle, so nice fluffy clouds. And now I'm doing the line art. So line art for me is very straightforward. I get my hard round brush, which is just the airbrush with the softness turned off, and put the smoothing up all the way to do a very sort of smooth line art layer. And then once I've done that, I'm going to go over it afterwards with the same brush but with no smoothing, and I'll darken it for all the areas that would be ambiently occluded. So thinking about what we talked about before with what ambient occlusion actually is. So it's going to be those hard to reach little spots. So things like where there's a fold in the fabric or where there's a crease under the arm. We're going to be looking for those sections to add that ambient occlusion to darken the line art. Now you can do a lot of different things with line art. You can have your line art thicker based on whether the surface it's on is facing towards or away from the light source. It really depends what you want to do with your inking. I do plan to make a video on inking later down the line, because there's basically an infinite number of ways to do inking and an infinite number of goals you can achieve by it. You can use your line art thickness to describe your directed light, you can use it for ambient light, you can use it to physically separate one part of the image from another. Now with that done, I'm just going to see about whether I should use some black for the eyes. But otherwise, that's the ambient occlusion done on top of the line art, and I'll merge that in, and now I've got my line art done. So then the next thing to do would be to knock out the flats. Now one thing you'll notice is that the dress looks pink. In the final image, the dress is going to look white, but it's going to be that pink color. If you put a pale pink over the top of white, it's going to look quite pink. If you put a really pale pink over the top of black, it's going to look white. So that pink there, I'm going to leave that, and it's going to look white. Once I darken the background and start adding shading to things, it'll just form part of that range of light and dark. And so here I'm just putting in the fluffy clouds, and I've got the figure slightly transparent, so I can see where I need to sort of spend my effort and where I don't. I don't turn the character off completely, because I'll end up then detailing a whole section of the background that'll be blocked by the huge straw hat, and that's a waste of everyone's time. So now I've just gone over and done a bit of shading on the clouds and tuned the color in a bit. Maybe trying to sort of warm it a bit, because it's a light from the ground. It's fairly close. And now I'm going to go over and do the basic shading layer. So this is going to be based off the vibes of that first one I did on the sketch. Now I've also used a copy of my flats to inform how the shading layer behaves. There's a bit of a trick to this. It's very straightforward, but if you're interested in having the shading sort of figure out the lightness, figure out the color for itself, I've got a video on that in my post-processing guide, so I'll link that here. Now I'm just going over and doing very simple bits of shading for the dress and where it's dropping that shadow. So this is the direct lighting and the cast shadow. And so separate to that, once I've done this, I'm going to go in and do the ambient occlusion. So that's the second layer of shading, where things are dark in the shadows. And that's how you add those sort of dark little occluded bits. But here I'm just getting the first layer of shading right before I move on to that level. So here you can see, even though the bottom surface of the hat is in shadow, that inside bit of the hat will be darker still, because it's hard for that ambient light to get in up under the hat there. And similarly, it'll be hard for it to get into like the stitching on the hat. So that's what I'll do the detail with. I'll do some of the detail in the shadows with the ambient occlusion layer. And so I'm just tuning the colors a little bit for that shading, just to make sure it's right. And then doing a bit more ambient occlusion shading there for where it's hard for the light to reach. So in the crevices and creases in the plaits, that's where the light's going to have trouble getting to, that ambient light. And then things like the back of the neck. That's where it's going to be difficult for the light to reach. And you can see I don't have to pay attention to which direction the primary light source is with this ambient occlusion light, because it's the light that's everywhere. And so I'm just doing a bit more on the face there. This is again ambient occlusion there to show that bridge of the nose where it sort of pinches in, and that's harder for the light to reach. Then there's the gap under the chin, which is harder for the light to reach. It's all these little spots that'd be hard to get in and, clean with a cloth. Those little crevices and nooks and crannies are where it's hard for ambient light to get in, so you'll get an ambient occlusion, which is the shadows they form. And now just looking at a secondary layer of shading to do on the underside of the dress. Here I decided I'd go with just basically shading the whole section in. And then you can see the ambient occlusion there does a good job for describing the fabric that's already in that shaded section. And it doesn't have to pay attention to the light source that the rest of it does, because ambient occlusion is just how hard is that nook and cranny to reach. And so you can see areas where there's a lot of detail, like that the bowstring around the waistband, there's going to be a lot of ambient occlusion there. And so just taking a zoomed out view to see where I need to drop a bit more. Overall, that's looking like it's got a lot of the ambient occlusion done. And just tuning in then some of those bits of shading and adding a bit of detail. Now, from here, I'm going to start doing some of those little effects. So I'm just doing the freckles here, just having a go at them, trying to make sure that they're not evenly spaced and evenly sized, which will make them look sort of very mechanical. I want them to look really organic, which means I'm going to spread them apart, have them small and big, and spread them down the arms. So anywhere where I think the sun would expose the character, I'll do them there. And now I'm just going to do a little bit of shine on the hair. It's just going to be a very subtle one because I just want it to be something to communicate that the material is glossy. So it's not going to be a bright highlight, but it's just going to be something to illustrate that it is a shiny sort of thing. And I made a bit of green to the background as well because I decided I wanted to put some sort of leaves in the foreground to communicate wind. And so narratively that does make sense to have a completely, treeless scenery and have leaves in the foreground. You've got to have something there to make it sort of make sense. So adding a bit of dark corners to the clouds there to help them work, and then just adding some green blobs. They don't really have to look like leaves. I'm going to make one look like a leaf, and that one's the one that's going to be in the foreground that you'll see, and then the viewer will sort of infer because that one is a leaf, the rest of these green blobs are going to be leaves as well. And now I'm just darkening the left side of the character to help contrast them with the background a bit. And then adding a bit of glow to the eyes, just to really sort of make it stand out as a highlight. Because even though it's in shadow, I want it to be the focus of the image. So that means I have to give it the most color contrast and the most tone contrast as well. And just adding a bit of highlight there to the edge of the hat. And now I'm going over and doing the subsurface scattering. Now this is another thing I cover off in that post-processing video I mentioned. So that's that same one that I linked before, on how to get that sort of glowing edge to the shadow where the light goes into the material, bounces around, and then comes back out, carrying a bit of color. And now I'm on the post-processing, so I'm just adding a bit of a sort of color hierarchy here, where I'll go over it with some yellow and a cooler color, set it to overlay, and that can help cool my shadows and warm my highlights. Now the next bit of post-processing I want to do is I'm going to soften the line art a bit. So I'll just get a bit of a lighter color and merge that with a line art layer. And now I'm going over and doing some skin tone variation and trying for a gradient map overlay on top as well. That one I'm not sure about, but this is the sort of the easy glow where you copy everything to a new layer. So duplicate to new layer, blur it, change the level so it gets deep fried, and then set it to overlay or screen. Again, that is covered off in the post-processing video. And with that, we're done. So we've gone through the different shadow types, we've gone through how to apply them, and we've gone through a speed paint, putting all those in perspective. Now, if you want to have a go yourself, there's going to be this homework sheet linked in the description. So have a go at that one. And then if you want to share it, you can come over to our Discord and share it there with everyone. That's basically it. So yeah, like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. If you like it and want to see, more stuff like it or more consistently, do consider becoming a member on our Patreon. You can get access to the original PSD files there. And of course, there'll be small group classes running there once I open up the Patreon tier for class attendance. Now, there's also posters of this and the other images on the Redbubble, other merch as well if you want it on a mug. So consider having a look at that there to support the channel if that's what you're after. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and you have a good day. Cheers. Bye.